From filmmakers losing tons of money to fans having their hearts absolutely crushed. These are movies that didn't meet the hype. The world was obsessed with the original Alien movie, and to this day, the franchise is as popular as ever. I mean, nobody can get enough of the masterpiece that Ridley Scott created. Fan rumors and speculation about an origin story were all over the place. Ever since 1986, people had been dying to get answers. But things died down a little after Alien Resurrection came out. I mean, that movie was a bit disappointing to say the least. Kudos to those who persisted though, because most people were still excited for the prequel they were all expecting. People were looking forward to a super well-made movie, and because it took them 10 years to finally come out with it, everybody thought that they had something magical going on behind the curtains. Obviously, most of the people left the cinemas frowning, because even after all those years, the writing was still below average. I mean, one of the few reasons that people wanted to see this movie in the first place is that they'd get to know how the entire concept for the original film came to be. But instead of answering all of that, it went out on its voyage, and well, the rest you know. This deeply underwhelming prequel was all it took for fans to lose faith in the franchise. Speaking of failing to meet the hype, you won't believe how disappointing our next film was. I'm talking about The Godfather 3. Quite a few people thought that Coppola should have just stopped with the first movie, and they might have been right. Don't get me wrong, the first two movies were absolute masterpieces, and they delivered more than anything at that time. But right after those, most of his next movies flopped. I mean, the man had been missing the mark for quite some time, and maybe he should have taken it as a sign and taken a break until his creative juices started flowing again. But instead, he resorted to his super hit saga once again. And in 1990, he came up with a brand new movie to add to the classics, The Godfather Part 3. It was all over the news and the fan base was practically brimming with excitement, only for it to end in disappointment. Michael Corleone was an absolute joke in this one, and Sophia was so appalled by her role in it, it drove her away from acting entirely. It's not like everybody hated it, but in no way did it match the classics, even in the slightest. So, ever since the year this film came out, most people prefer to simply forget that it's also part of the franchise. Speaking of sequels that failed to meet the hype, we have got to talk about Spider-Man 3. As soon as the first Spider-Man movie was released, it set the bar for all superhero movies to come. I mean, it was a marvel of its time. And even when the second movie came out, people still couldn't get enough of the Spidey universe. Obviously, the filmmakers had to listen to their fans' cries for more, and they needed to respond. That's when they came out with the third edition to the series. And though it wasn't that bad, it still came out as the weakest movie in the entire franchise. I mean, the storyline was a bit wonky, and the direction it was taking became hard to follow at one point. Not to mention, the dude they cast as Venom simply didn't fit into the role. Now, not everybody hated it, but everything good about this movie got buried under the debris of bad choices. And what could have been a super hit movie became mediocre at best. Still, it wasn't the only superhero movie that was destined to disappoint, and just couldn't meet the hype. Enter Superman Returns. As soon as Singer announced the return of the Man of Steel, fans were ecstatic, especially because they knew that they'd trust this man to do justice to this comeback. I mean, I was also expecting there to be a wholly fresh perspective on Superman, like something I had never seen before. But things didn't go as planned, mainly because he turned it into a sequel to the original 1978 movie. Now that was a super bad decision right there. He had to go along with a lot of the flawed themes of the previous movie, which meant that Brandon Routh's ill-suited Superman was still there, and Kevin Spacey was still Lex Luthor. So in a way, a lot of the potential got wasted. The plot was super underwhelming, and his idea just didn't translate well. He was trying to bring the 70s vibe into it, but maybe 2006 wasn't the best time to try stunts like that. As much as you would have loved to see this movie soar into the sky, it just ended up squandering all hopes for the Superman movies to come. And it's especially heartbreaking just how easily this could have been avoided. Just like the next movie on the list, Pearl Harbor. I mean, if anything were to even slightly suggest a resemblance to Titanic, the fans were all here for it. And that is probably why nobody could wait for this one to finally hit the screens. With Michael Bay going through his peak filmmaking days back then, and an exceptional cast of Kate Beckinsale, Josh Hartnett, and Ben Affleck, nobody would have expected it to be a flop. But instead of a simple retelling of the Pearl Harbor attack, all it did was give us a bunch of lousy dialogue and poorly done storylines. Bay was trying to talk about one of the most powerful moments in human history through this film. But the point flew right out the window with this disaster. So many things ended up being overdone, it was honestly hard to count. The film was destined to be one of the greatest hits of its time, but in the end, simply became a joke. And believe it or not, it still is. The dumb lines and lack of chemistry between the stars were unbearable. The movie made it clear that Bay is not a perfect director, but not everything can live up to the legends, as you'll see in the next film, The Hobbit. Seeing just how well The Lord of the Rings came out, obviously it had fans begging for an adaptation of the prequel, especially because of how incomplete it all felt without it. But then 2012 came, and Peter Jackson finally made our dreams come true. Only, it wasn't in the way that everybody wanted. I mean, it can never be a good idea to drag one book out to fit into a whole trilogy. It was too simple to be explored for that long. Not to mention, the CGI was simply horrible and too overdone. So much so that it ended up making the entire film lose its essence. No one wanted this to start looking like a video game. But things went south real quick as the people got to the third movie. I simply couldn't believe that they created all of that hype around the dragon Smaug just to go ahead and kill him right at the start of the third movie. Now that was infuriating. Jackson only rested after he had turned the entire Middle-earth into a whole mess. So it's safe to say that fans lost all faith by that point, and it just became a sad end to a legendary era. There you have it, ladies and gents. Those are the movies that didn't meet the hype.